The ticking of the clock was the first sound that stayed with me. Not the voices of people, not the roar of traffic outside, not even the clatter of coins or the crisp rustle of bills. It was the sound of time itself, echoing through a narrow room where a single desk lamp burned deep into the night. I remember the way the light carved shadows across the wall, how it made the dust in the air look like falling stars in a universe that belonged only to me. That night, I held $10 in my hand, a bill folded twice, creased and tired, but full of possibility. The paper smelled faintly of coffee, of hands that had passed it along, of choices made and forgotten. $10. Nothing and everything. Don't forget to subscribe, to leave a comment, and to press the like button before we dive in. Every gesture helps this message reach more people. I had no empire then, no grand plan, not even the certainty that I was capable of more than surviving. I was young, restless, and the world felt too large for someone with empty pockets and heavy dreams. Yet that bill in my hand was a key, even if I didn't know what door it might open. I turned it over and over, listening to the clock, the seconds falling like drops of water into an endless well. Each tick reminded me that wealth is measured not only in money, but in what you do with your time. The office where I sat wasn't mine. It belonged to a friend who let me use the space after hours. The air smelled of old paper and cheap ink. Filing cabinets stood like silent guards, their drawers locked, secrets hidden behind metal. A cracked mirror leaned against the wall, and whenever I caught my reflection in it, I barely recognized myself. Thin, anxious eyes, fingers stained with pen marks, shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying the weight of futures not yet written. I stared at that reflection and asked a question I still ask to this day. Who are you when no one is watching? That night was not about business plans or market charts. It was about listening. To the room, to myself, to the clock. I laid the $10 bill flat on the desk, smoothed the creases, and imagined it multiplying. Not magically, not in a gambler's dream, but through patience, through small steps that would build upon each other. 10 would become 20. 20 would become 50. And maybe one day, I thought, I wouldn't just be holding money, I would be holding freedom. The first lesson came in silence. Before you invest in anything, you must invest in attention. To see clearly where the money can go, to notice the doors others walk past, to hear the whisper beneath the noise. That $10 could have bought me a meal, a fleeting comfort. Instead, I promised myself it would buy me a future. Not because of the number written on the bill, but because of the choice behind it. I folded it once more, slid it into my pocket, and walked out into the street. The night was cold, the pavement slick with rain. Neon lights flickered in puddles, colors breaking and reforming with each ripple as cars passed. People hurried by, clutching bags, huddling into coats, chasing destinations I couldn't see. I walked slowly, as if the city itself were testing me, daring me to hold on to my promise. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted from a cart at the corner. My stomach ached with hunger, but I kept walking. That was the first sacrifice, and it tasted of discipline. I understood then that wealth begins not with gain, but with refusal. To refuse the easy choice, the instant reward, the comfort that vanishes as quickly as it arrives. Every dollar is a seed, and some seeds must be buried, not eaten. When I reached my small apartment, the walls greeted me with silence. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its light harsh and honest. I placed the bill on the table beside my bed and for nights it stayed there, like a quiet guardian. It reminded me each morning when I woke that opportunity is fragile, easily spent, easily lost. The clock ticked there too, softer but no less relentless. I began to study, not the markets at first, but myself, where my money went, how I spent without thought, how often I confused need with desire. I filled notebooks with numbers, tracking coins and bills like a watchman keeping guard over a city gate. Patterns emerged, habits of waste, impulses that drained me, small leaks in a fragile boat. To fix them was not glamorous, but it was necessary. Before you invest outward, you must seal the cracks within. Days blurred into weeks. I took small jobs, saved coins, added them to the bill. 10 became 15. 15 became 25. It felt like climbing a staircase in the dark, one cautious step at a time, the air heavy with uncertainty. But each step made the next one easier. Each dollar added was a brick laid into a foundation I couldn't yet see. And always the clock was there, ticking in the background, steady, impartial, reminding me that wealth is not built in rushes, but in rhythms. The key was patience. The mirror told me the same story. Each day I saw the same face, but a little less doubt, a little more resolve. My reflection began to look like someone I could believe in. The world outside still offered temptations. New shoes in a store window, a night out with friends, a warm drink on a cold evening. But I carried the memory of that first refusal. The chestnuts I did not buy, and each time I walked past temptation, I felt richer. Not in money, but in strength. Wealth begins there, in the unseen victories. I began to look for doors where my $10 could knock. A second-hand bookstore became my first investment. Not in stocks, not in bonds, not in flashy schemes, but in knowledge. I bought a thin, worn-out copy of a book on investing, its cover faded, its pages annotated by some unknown hand. It cost less than $10, but it gave me more than 100 meals could. It fed my mind, and in that nourishment, I found the beginnings of wealth. I read late into the night, the lamp flickering, the city outside fading into silence. The author spoke of compounding, not just of money, but of effort, of choices, of time. The idea struck me like a key turning in a lock. Compounding meant that small could become great, that patience could turn drops into rivers. The book smelled of dust and old ink, but to me it smelled like a promise. And so I began. I turned page after page until my eyes burned. But I would not let go of the thought that every word could become a stepping stone. I underlined sentences with a dull pencil, the graphite smudging across my fingers, staining the edges of the paper. The lamp hissed faintly as it warmed, and the air grew heavy with the scent of heated dust. The clock ticked steadily, as if approving my discipline. In those nights, I learned that investing wasn't first about markets or numbers. It was about mindset. $10 was never only $10. It was time. It was choice. It was discipline. It was the refusal of comfort for the promise of freedom. I remember writing in my notebook, "Money is a mirror. It reflects what you are." The reflection I saw frightened me at first. I saw impatience, weakness, the hunger for quick fixes. But the more I wrote, the more I wrestled with those truths, the more I began to understand that the fight for wealth is the fight against yourself. It is the battle to silence the voices that urge you to consume what you could plant, to waste what you could grow. One evening, I walked past a pawn shop. In the window lay watches, their faces gleaming under fluorescent light. Time for sale. Time measured in gold and silver, ticking louder in my imagination than on the shelves. I stopped, staring at them, thinking about how ironic it was. People pawning away their hours, their past, their hopes, in exchange for quick cash. The reflection of those watches merged with my own face in the glass, and for a moment it felt like a warning. Never pawn your future for the present. Never sell tomorrow for today. I tightened my grip on the $10 still folded in my pocket. It was not much, but it was mine. More than that, it was my promise to myself. I turned away from the glowing watches and walked into the cold evening. The city smelled of rain and gasoline, of baked bread from a nearby shop, of smoke from chimneys curling into the night. Each scent felt like a temptation, but also like a reminder of what I was building. Over weeks and months, I layered discipline upon discipline. I bought another book, then a third. Knowledge piled up like bricks, forming walls in my mind strong enough to hold back impulse. I read about savings accounts, about interest, about how even the smallest sum, left untouched, could grow like a tree pushing through cracks in stone. I learned about risk, about how fear blinds people to opportunity, how greed blinds them just the same. Every lesson was a key turning in some hidden lock. I began to hear the world differently. The conversations on the street no longer sounded like idle chatter. I heard people revealing their mistakes. The jingling of coins in pockets was no longer noise. It was the rhythm of choices being made. Even the silence of an empty wallet spoke, a reminder of what happens when you live only for the day. I realized that the world is always teaching those who are willing to listen. $10 had bought me not wealth yet, but the ability to hear those whispers. And then came my first true decision. I stood before a small stall one Saturday morning. The air was sharp with the smell of fresh fruit and damp earth. A vendor sold apples in small baskets, their skins glistening red under the pale sun. People hurried by, buying without thought. But I stopped, watching. I asked the vendor his price. Cheap enough. Cheaper still if I bought more than one basket. I had just enough saved to take a risk. I thought of the clock. I thought of the mirror. I thought of the key in my hand disguised as a wrinkled bill, and I bought 2 baskets. I did not eat them. I carried them to a busier street, where the crowds flowed faster, and I sold the apples one by one. My voice was unsteady, my palms damp, but slowly, coins clinked into my pocket. By evening, I had turned my 10 into 15. It was small, laughably small by the world's standards. But to me, it was proof. Proof that money could be multiplied, that patience and observation could bend the world, however slightly, in my favor. That night I sat by the lamp, the coins spread across the table, their metallic scent mixing with the smell of paper and ink. I touched each coin as though it were sacred. They weren't just money. They were hours of my life reclaimed, transformed. I understood then that wealth is not about the scale, but about the direction. Every upward step, however small, sets the rhythm for the next. I kept repeating the process, not always with apples, sometimes with small trinkets, sometimes with books I bought and resold. Each time I learned something. The courage to speak to strangers, the discipline to resist spending my profits, the humility to accept failure when I miscalculated. I watched the coins grow into bills, the bills into stacks, and each time I returned to the cracked mirror in the office to ask, "Who are you now?" My reflection began to change. The hunch in my shoulders lifted slightly. The fear in my eyes softened. I still looked like a boy wrestling with shadows, but there was light now, faint but steady. The clock continued ticking, impartial and merciless. But instead of haunting me, it began to guide me. Each tick was a reminder that progress does not need to be fast. It only needs to be constant. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. There were still nights when doubt pressed heavy against me. Nights when the silence of the room felt suffocating. Nights when the smell of coffee grew bitter, and my reflection in the mirror seemed more stranger than friend. But I always returned to the thought of compounding. That growth is not a sudden leap, but an accumulation. 10 to 15, 15 to 20, 20 to 30. Not spectacular, but steady. I began keeping a key in my pocket at all times. Not to open any real door, but to remind myself that every choice was a lock waiting for the right turn. Sometimes I would touch it when the temptation grew strong, when the city's lights promised pleasure for a price. The cold metal grounded me. It whispered, "Hold the line. Wait for the door that matters." I carried that key, the ticking clock in my ears, and the reflection of the mirror in my mind as I walked through those years. And slowly, steadily, I built the discipline that no one could see but me. The kind of discipline that turns $10 into lifelong wealth. The mornings in those days were always cold, even in summer. The air carried the faint chill of uncertainty, and each sunrise seemed to demand an answer to a question I hadn't yet learned how to articulate. I woke in my small apartment with its bare walls and single dangling bulb, the smell of dust and last night's coffee still lingering, and I would sit by the table where my coins and bills lay like trophies from a war no one else knew I was fighting. I would count them slowly, listening to the clock, feeling the weight of each piece as though it carried more than its worth. They weren't just units of currency. They were fragments of my will, my discipline, my refusal to surrender. I remember one morning holding a $1 coin, turning it between my fingers until the edges bit into my skin. I thought about how many lives it had touched before mine, how many pockets, how many stories. Money always has ghosts attached to it. The laughter of someone who spent it on joy. The regret of someone who lost it too quickly. The resignation of someone who traded it for necessity. In my hands, I wanted it to carry something different. Purpose. That was the beginning of understanding wealth, not as accumulation, but as direction. I started mapping my days with almost obsessive precision. Every hour accounted for, every dollar tracked, every choice weighed. Some would call it suffocating, but to me, it was liberation. Because within that discipline, I discovered space. The space to think, to plan, to imagine. The clock was no longer just ticking away my life. It was beating like a drum, marking the rhythm of a march forward. The city around me grew louder as I learned to listen. The clamor of markets, the chatter of vendors, the clink of coins in strangers' hands. It all became a symphony of lessons. I watched how people bought without thinking, how they surrendered to impulse, how they mistook desire for need. I saw others who hesitated too long, paralyzed by fear, watching opportunities slip by like shadows at dusk. And I stood between them, learning to balance courage and patience, to move not too fast and not too slow. One afternoon, I saw a man at a street corner trying to sell umbrellas. The sky was clear, the sun sharp, and no one paid him attention. His voice grew hoarse, his arms weary from holding up the same umbrella. I watched him fail. and something inside me shifted. Timing, I realized, was everything. A good product, a good price, even good intention. None of it mattered without timing. The next week, when clouds gathered and rain slicked the streets, I saw another vendor sell out his stock in minutes. Same umbrellas, different moment. The clock again whispered its lesson. Wealth belongs to those who can wait for the right hour. I began to see patterns in everything. The way shadows lengthened across the street, the way people hurried when the wind turned cold, the way demand rose and fell like tides. I studied not just books, but sidewalks, not just theories, but habits. Every detail mattered. The scent of roasted nuts meant hungry crowds. The sound of coins clinking faster meant someone was making profit. The silence of an empty stall meant failure. I trained my senses until they were sharper than numbers on a page. And with each observation, I grew bolder. I reinvested my modest profits into slightly larger risks. A stack of notebooks that I resold to students before exam season. Bottles of water during a particularly hot summer day. I learned to anticipate, to see 2 steps ahead, to let the rhythm of the city guide me like a hidden current. The money grew slowly, but it grew with intention, and every small success was a brick in a foundation no one else could see. Yet it wasn't always victory. I remember a night when I bought too much candles from a wholesaler, convinced the power outages in the neighborhood would continue. But the light stayed on, the city humming steadily, and I was left with boxes stacked to the ceiling, the waxy smell filling my apartment until it made me nauseous. Failure has a scent. It lingers. It clings to you. It whispers doubts in the dark hours. I stared at those candles for weeks, the flame of my ambition flickering. But then I learned the second great rule. Nothing is wasted if you learn from it. I sold them slowly, one by one, at a loss. Each sale was painful, like cutting away a piece of myself. But each coin returned to me carried more than its metal weight. It carried a lesson etched into it like a scar. Do not confuse prediction with certainty. Do not bet beyond your patience. The mirror in the corner showed me my disappointment, but it also showed me resolve. I told myself, this loss is tuition. Pay it, and keep learning. And so I did. My notebook filled with scribbles, reminders, numbers, patterns, keys drawn in the margins, clocks sketched beside them, mirrors shaded with pencil lines. They became symbols of my journey. The key for opportunity, the clock for timing, the mirror for reflection. I began to see them not only on paper, but in my days. A key glinting in a stranger's hand, the tick of a clock in a cafe, my reflection in a shop window. All reminders that wealth was not outside of me, but within my choices. As weeks turned into months, my $10 had long since multiplied. Not into riches, not yet, but into momentum. And momentum, I discovered, is more powerful than luck. Because once you are moving, once you are learning, once you are compounding discipline upon discipline, the world itself begins to bend in your direction. Opportunities reveal themselves like doors you hadn't noticed before, waiting for your key. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. There were mornings when I woke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through thin curtains, the smell of damp air seeping in, and I felt the weight of my small progress as if it were gold. Not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. Control. Control over myself, over my time, over the temptation to trade tomorrow for today. That was when I realized the truth hidden in the $10 bill. It was never about the money. It was about becoming the kind of person who could transform it. And so I kept going. One small investment at a time, one disciplined choice after another, one lesson carved into memory by failure and persistence. The clock ticked on, impartial as ever. But instead of fearing it, I began to walk in step with it. Every second was no longer a loss. It was an opportunity. And with that, the journey from $10 to lifelong wealth had truly begun. The first time I felt the real weight of compounding was not in a ledger, nor on a bank statement, but in the silence of an early morning when I realized that my small, disciplined acts had begun to accumulate into something larger than myself. It was winter then. The radiator in my apartment hissed like a tired animal, unable to chase away the chill that seeped into the corners. I sat at the table where my coins and bills had long since outgrown the small box I kept them in. There was a heavier sound when I moved the stack now, a deeper rustle when I counted. 10 had become 50. 50 had become 200. And though it still seemed fragile, it was undeniably real. The smell of paper filled the air, mixed with dust, and the faint aroma of stale coffee that never seemed to leave the room. I held one bill up to the light, watching the way it glowed pale and translucent. The fibers, like veins in living skin. I thought of how many hours of work, how many small denials, how many moments of discipline were woven into that single piece of paper. Money is never neutral. It carries the fingerprints of choices. And in that moment, I understood that every dollar I saved was no longer just an object. It was a vote for the person I wanted to become. The clock ticked in the corner, each sound sharper in the cold, echoing against the thin walls. Time was moving, as it always did. But for the first time, I felt as though I was moving with it. I was not falling behind, not scrambling to catch up. I was walking in rhythm, step by step, coin by coin, bill by bill. That rhythm became addictive. Not the kind of addiction that drains you, but the kind that anchors you, that gives your life a steady pulse. I began to see compounding everywhere, not just in numbers, but in habits, in thoughts, in reflections. A small act repeated daily became a fortress. A single refusal of impulse became 1,000 victories stretched across years. Even failure, when endured and studied, compounded into wisdom. I realized that wealth was not only measured in what I gained, but in what I carried within me. Patience, discipline, clarity. One day, I passed a bookstore window and saw my reflection layered over a display of financial guides. The glass caught the light in such a way that the words and my face merged. It was as though the mirror had followed me there, whispering again, "Who are you now?" I stepped inside and bought a second-hand volume on the basics of investing stocks, bonds, interest rates, the language of money that had once seemed like a foreign tongue. I carried it home in a paper bag that smelled faintly of ink and dust. And that night, I read until my eyes blurred. The book spoke of markets rising and falling, of companies growing like trees, of risks that could be measured and managed. It was not glamorous, not filled with secrets of instant wealth, but it was steady, practical, grounded. And that was what I needed. I learned the idea of ownership, that even the smallest stake in something larger than myself could tether me to a world of growth. I learned about dividends, about money that earns while you sleep, about planting seeds that sprout quietly in the soil of time. The idea thrilled me. $10 could not yet buy me a share of a company, but it could buy me the understanding of how. Knowledge, I realized, was the cheapest investment with the highest return. The book became my mirror, showing me not just who I was, but who I could become. I began saving with sharper focus. Every coin that clinked into my box was no longer just savings. It was a future share, a future investment, a key waiting to open a door. I cut deeper into my expenses. I walked instead of taking the bus. I brewed my own coffee instead of buying it from the cafe that filled the street with its sweet aroma each morning. Each sacrifice smelled like bitterness in the moment, but each one tasted like freedom later. When I finally placed my first small investment into a simple, low-cost index fund that I had researched late into the night, it felt like handing my time over to the future. I remember the glow of the computer screen in the dark room, the click of the mouse, the confirmation window appearing. It was not glamorous. No one applauded. No doors swung open. No riches poured in. But I felt a tremor run through me, as though I had shifted something deep within the earth beneath my feet. I closed my eyes and imagined that first investment as a seed dropped into soil. I could not see it grow, not yet, but the knowledge that it was there, buried and alive, changed everything. I carried myself differently. I walked with a straighter back, as though I had stepped onto a path that stretched beyond the horizon. Of course, doubt lingered. There were days when the market dipped, when the small balance I checked late at night looked weaker, when fear whispered that I had been foolish. But I reminded myself of the umbrellas, of the timing, of the key in my pocket. I reminded myself that growth is not a straight line, but a rhythm, and that the clock is always ticking regardless of whether you move with it or against it. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. I kept going. Each month I added what I could. Sometimes only a handful of dollars, sometimes more, but always something. It became a ritual. The transfer of money into that account. The quiet satisfaction of watching the balance nudge upward. The reminder that this was not just money, but a reflection of my discipline. I learned to love the slowness, to embrace the idea that wealth worth having is wealth worth waiting for. And slowly, imperceptibly, things began to change. The cracked mirror in the corner still showed my tired eyes and thin frame, but now it also showed resolve. The key in my pocket no longer felt symbolic. It felt heavy, real, like a promise I carried with me everywhere. The clock still ticked, impartial as ever, but instead of mocking me, it now marched beside me, each second a step forward. It was in those days that I realized the most important truth of all. The $10 had never been the point. The point was the person I was becoming, the kind of person who could take something small and through patience, discipline, and reflection, turn it into something infinite. And with that realization, I understood. Wealth is not outside of you. It begins within. And so, I kept building. There was a night when the city seemed to hold its breath, the streets quieter than usual, the lamps casting long shadows across the wet pavement. I sat in my small apartment, the window cracked open just enough for the cool air to seep in, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and car exhaust. The stack of notes on my desk had grown thicker, bound with a worn elastic band that had lost much of its stretch. I remember running my fingers over the edges of the paper, the way the fibers rasped against my skin. Money does not just sit there. It hums. It vibrates. It speaks if you listen closely enough. And that night, it whispered of possibility. I thought about my journey from that single folded bill to this growing pile. It had not been spectacular, not fast, not glamorous, but it was steady. And in that steadiness, I found something more valuable than wealth itself. Trust in myself. That trust became the foundation on which I would build everything else. The mirror in the corner reflected me faintly, half shadowed, half lit by the lamp. My face seemed older than the years I had lived, not in lines or wrinkles, but in weight. The weight of decisions, of sacrifices, of hours spent studying while others sought pleasure. I leaned closer, studying the reflection as though it were a stranger. You are no longer the boy with $10 in his pocket, I thought. You are becoming someone else. The mirror did not answer, but it didn't need to. It had already shown me what I had become. The clock ticked louder in the silence, each second measured, relentless. I realized then that time was the truest currency. Money could be gained and lost, but time was always spent. To invest money was simple compared to investing time. Every hour I gave to learning, to building discipline, to resisting temptation, was worth more than any coin or bill. And in that realization, I discovered the hidden truth behind compounding. It is not only money that compounds, but time itself. The key in my pocket grew heavier with each passing day. I would take it out sometimes, place it on the desk beside the money, watching how the light caught its metal edges. It had no door to open, no lock to turn, but it symbolized every unseen door that lay ahead of me. I knew there would be moments when the right opportunity would present itself, and I had to be ready, not scrambling, not begging, but prepared. That key was not for today, it was for tomorrow. I began to expand my horizon. I studied not just the basics of investing, but the psychology of it. I read about fear, about greed, about how markets rise and fall, not because of numbers alone, but because of the people behind them. I realized that investing was less about predicting the future and more about mastering yourself in the present. The more I learned, the more I understood that most people lose, not because they lack opportunity, but because they lack patience. There was an evening when I sat in a cafe, the smell of roasted beans and warm milk hanging heavy in the air, and I overheard two men speaking. Their voices were urgent, filled with excitement. They were chasing a sure thing, a hot tip that promised quick riches. I watched them lean in, their eyes gleaming, their words tumbling over one another. And I felt no envy, only caution. I had seen the trap laid too many times. Quick money rarely stays. It slips through fingers like sand, leaving only regret behind. I stirred my cup slowly, the spoon clinking against the porcelain, and reminded myself of the lesson I had already learned. Slow is steady. Steady is strong. I walked home that night with the sound of their voices still echoing in my mind. And when I reached my apartment, I placed a new note into my growing stack. The smell of paper was sharp, almost metallic, and I breathed it in as though it were a promise. My wealth was not yet large, but it was honest. Every dollar was earned, saved, and placed with intention. It was not luck, it was discipline. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. Months turned into years, and with them, the rhythm of my life changed. The once empty apartment filled with books, notebooks, scraps of paper covered in numbers and thoughts. The cracked mirror still leaned in the corner, but the reflection it offered no longer looked uncertain. The clock still ticked, impartial and steady, but I no longer feared its sound. It had become a companion, a reminder that every second mattered. And the key still sat in my pocket, heavier than ever, reminding me that the right door would one day appear. The first true test came when I had saved enough to consider something larger. A stock, not just in theory, but in reality. I remember sitting before the glowing computer screen, the cursor blinking, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was dry, the faint hum of electricity filling the silence. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into uncertainty. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the mouse. Doubt whispered, "What if you lose it? What if all this effort crumbles in one careless click?" But another voice rose within me, steadier, stronger. The voice built from nights of discipline, from refusals, from small victories and learned failures. "This is not gambling," it said. "This is planting." I exhaled slowly, clicked, and in that moment, I crossed a threshold. The investment was modest, almost laughably so by the world's standards. But to me, it was monumental, because it was proof that I had transformed. $10 in my hand had once been everything I owned. Now I was shaping money into something larger, something that worked for me while the clock ticked and the world slept. I closed the computer and sat in silence. The apartment seemed different, though nothing had changed. The air felt charged, as though the very walls recognized the step I had taken. The mirror caught my reflection again, and for the first time, I saw not just who I was, but who I could be. I touched the key in my pocket, felt the cool metal press against my palm, and I understood. This was only the beginning. The journey from $10 to lifelong wealth was not about the numbers themselves, but about the transformation they demanded. The clock ticked on, and I smiled, ready for the next step. And so I continued, deeper into the rhythm of compounding, discipline, and reflection, knowing that every second, every choice, every dollar was carrying me forward into a life I had once only dreamed of. The days began to blur together, not because they were empty, but because they were so full of repetition, of ritual, of the quiet work that no one applauds. Dawn would break pale and gray against the window pane, and I would rise to the sound of the clock, its rhythm pulling me from sleep as though it were an alarm older than any machine. The floor was cold against my feet, the air sharp with the scent of dust and paper. I would sit at the same wooden table, the stack of notes resting like a silent monument before me, and I would begin again, writing, counting, studying, refining. There was nothing glamorous about it. No fireworks, no sudden transformation. Wealth was not a lightning strike, but a slow-burning flame, tended carefully, shielded from the winds of impulse and despair. I understood this more with each passing week. My $10 had become more than money. It had become a habit, a rhythm, a mirror reflecting the kind of man I was becoming. I remember the weight of the first dividend payment I received, though it was small, laughably small. Just a fraction of $1, deposited into my account almost unnoticed by the world. But to me, it was everything. It was proof that money could work while I rested, that seeds planted long ago could bear fruit without my constant touch. I stared at that number on the screen, the faint glow casting a pale light across my tired face, and I whispered to myself, "This is how it begins." The smell of old coffee lingered in the room as I sat there, unable to look away from the screen. That fraction of $1 was not about the amount. It was about the principle. Compounding was no longer theory. It was alive, breathing, growing in the background while the clock ticked on. For the first time, I felt the strange, exhilarating sensation of freedom. Not the full freedom of wealth, but the freedom of possibility. The key in my pocket pressed against my leg as I leaned back in the chair, heavy with meaning. I imagined doors opening somewhere ahead of me, unseen yet inevitable. Each small act of discipline, each dollar invested, was a turn of the key, a click in the lock. One day, I knew, the door would swing open and I would step into a new world. Until then, I would keep turning, one patient motion at a time. I began to notice how my perception of money changed. Before, a bill was just a bill, a coin just a coin. Now, each piece was a story, a possibility, a fragment of time stored in physical form. I no longer asked, "What can I buy with this?" Instead, I asked, "What can this become if I let it grow?" That shift was subtle, but it changed everything. It turned temptation into opportunity, weakness into strength. The mirror in the corner of the room continued to remind me of the transformation. I would catch my reflection when I least expected it. Sometimes in the soft light of dawn, sometimes in the harsh glow of midnight. My eyes no longer darted with doubt. They were steadier, calmer, though still carrying the weight of ambition. I would stand before the mirror, listening to the clock, feeling the key in my pocket, and I would remind myself, you are not chasing wealth. You are building yourself into the kind of man who can hold it. There were setbacks, of course. Days when the market fell, when my account balance dipped, when fear clawed at the edges of my resolve. I remember one such day vividly. The numbers on the screen were red, glowing like wounds, and for a moment, I felt the urge to pull out, to protect what little I had built. My hand hovered over the mouse, the room thick with silence, the smell of iron and dust filling my nose. But then the clock ticked, steady, indifferent. I looked into the mirror, and the reflection reminded me of every sacrifice, every night of study, every coin refused for the sake of growth. And I did nothing. I held the line. That inaction, that patience, was harder than any action I had ever taken. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. With time, I began to understand another truth. Investing was never just about money. It was about character. The market tested me more than it rewarded me. It asked me to wait when I wanted to act when I wanted to wait, to trust myself when doubt screamed loudest. Each test was another mirror, showing me parts of myself I had never seen before. I learned to love the silence of waiting. The long stretches where nothing seemed to change were not wasted. They were the soil in which compounding did its secret work. In those moments, I grew more than my money did. I learned patience not as a concept, but as a lived reality, etched into my bones by hours of stillness. The city outside continued its restless dance, cars rushing, voices rising, neon lights flashing. But I walked through it differently now. Every sound, every scent, every flicker of light reminded me of the journey. The clink of coins in a stranger's hand reminded me of choices. The smell of freshly baked bread reminded me of sacrifices. The glow of a street lamp against wet pavement reminded me of the nights I walked home with only $10 in my pocket. I carried all these images with me, layering them like bricks into the foundation of who I was becoming. And with each layer, I grew steadier, clearer, more resolved. The clock ticked on, the key pressed against my leg. The mirror reflected my growth, and I knew, without doubt, that I was on a path that would not end with wealth alone, but with something far greater: freedom. And so, I pressed forward, deeper into the rhythm of time, money, and discipline, knowing that every step, no matter how small, carried me closer to the life I was building. The winters grew shorter, or perhaps I simply grew more patient. Cold mornings no longer bit at me with the same cruelty. They became part of the rhythm, another test of discipline. I would rise while the city still slept, the pale gray light seeping through the thin curtains, and I would sit at that same wooden table where so much of my journey had begun. The desk bore scars now, scratches from coins dragged across its surface, stains from spilled coffee, impressions of scribbled notes pressed into the grain. It had become more than a table. It was a witness, carrying the memory of every decision I had made. The stack of money on its surface had grown thicker, bound tightly with paper bands that smelled faintly of ink and glue. I touched them not with greed, but with reverence. Each note carried a history, a sacrifice, a refusal, an act of faith. They were no longer just paper. They were the physical manifestation of my transformation. I counted them slowly, not to reassure myself of the total, but to remind myself of the journey. The rustle of bills was not noise, it was music, a song of persistence and patience. The clock ticked in the corner, steady, impartial, reminding me that time was the only wealth I could never reclaim. I had learned to hear it differently now. Where once it had sounded like a threat, it now beat like a metronome, guiding me forward, reminding me to stay in rhythm. Each second was a seed planted, invisible but certain, destined to sprout if I only let it. The mirror in the room, cracked and leaning, no longer frightened me. My reflection had changed. The boy who once stared back with restless eyes was gone. In his place stood a man shaped by sacrifice and patience. The shoulders were straighter, the gaze steadier, the lines of doubt softened into lines of focus. I studied that reflection often, not out of vanity, but as a reminder. Wealth is not measured by what you hold in your hands, but by who you become in the process of seeking it. And the key. Always the key. I carried it in my pocket until it was warm from my body heat, until its grooves pressed faintly into my skin. Sometimes, in moments of temptation, when the world glittered with distractions, I would hold it tight, the cold metal grounding me, reminding me that doors worth opening take time to find. The key was not for the doors of pleasure or impulse. It was for the future, for the door that patience alone could reveal. It was around this time that I began to see the world in terms of opportunity, not in a predatory way, but in a patient one. A clearance sale at a bookstore was no longer just discounted paper. It was knowledge waiting to be acquired. A conversation overheard on a train was no longer idle chatter. It was insight into human behavior, into patterns of fear and desire. Even failure, when it came, was no longer defeat. It was tuition, paid in advance for wisdom, yet to be applied. I remember vividly the first time I lost money in the market. The numbers turned red, harsh against the glow of the screen, and my stomach twisted. The air grew heavy, the smell of dust and metal sharper, as though the room itself conspired against me. For hours I sat there, frozen, watching the loss grow. My hand trembled above the mouse, ready to sell, to cut the wound before it bled me dry. But then the clock ticked, steady, indifferent, and I looked into the mirror. The reflection stared back, calm, almost defiant. You knew this would come, I told myself. You prepared for this. Don't run. And so I did nothing. I held my ground. Days later, the market turned. The wound healed, and the numbers climbed again. The relief was immense, but the real reward was deeper. I had proven to myself that I could endure, that I was not a slave to fear, that I could stand still when everything inside me screamed to run. That lesson was worth more than the money itself. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. As my savings grew, so too did my habits. I no longer saw money as something to be spent, but as something to be allocated, directed like a river toward fertile ground. Each dollar had a purpose, a destination. Some went to investments, some to savings, some to knowledge. Nothing was wasted. Even leisure, when I allowed it, was chosen with intention. I discovered that true wealth is not only in what you accumulate, but in how you direct what you already have. The city itself became a classroom. The sound of footsteps rushing across wet pavement taught me about urgency and fear. The smell of fresh bread from a bakery reminded me of temptation and discipline. The sight of neon signs reflected in puddles reminded me of illusions, bright, fleeting, often empty. Everywhere I looked, the world spoke if I was willing to listen. There came a day when I realized I was no longer thinking in terms of days or weeks, but in years, even decades. Compounding had reshaped my perception of time. I no longer craved immediate reward. I craved growth, even if it was invisible, even if it was slow. I learned to celebrate not the purchase of something new, but the patience of waiting, the discipline of holding. Each month that passed without surrendering to impulse felt like victory. My friends did not understand. They spent freely, chasing pleasures, trading their hours for moments of fleeting comfort. They laughed when I refused to join them, when I saved instead of spending, when I spoke of the future as though it were already in my hands. Their laughter stung at first, but over time it became fuel. For every coin I saved, for every bill I invested, I reminded myself that freedom wasn't built on approval, but on discipline. And so I continued. The stack of bills grew, the investments multiplied, the dividends dripped steadily like rain filling a reservoir. The clock ticked, the mirror reflected, the key waited, and I walked forward one step at a time, knowing that the journey from $10 to lifelong wealth was not about rushing, not about gambling, not about luck. It was about rhythm, patience, and the unshakable belief that time, when respected, becomes your greatest ally. And so I pressed on, deeper into the silence, deeper into the discipline, deeper into the quiet compounding of a life, built not on desire, but on choice. There were nights when exhaustion pressed so heavily against me that the simple act of keeping my eyes open felt like lifting a weight too great for my body. Yet even then, I found myself returning to the desk, the lamp flickering above stacks of notes and scribbled ledgers. The hum of the city outside was distant, muffled by rain tapping against the glass. In that stillness, I would open my notebook and trace lines of numbers with a pencil worn down almost to nothing. Each number carried meaning, profit, loss, potential, lesson, and together they formed a language more honest than any spoken word. Wealth, I had come to understand, is not only built by addition, but also by subtraction, by subtracting waste, by subtracting impulse, by subtracting excuses. Every time I cut away something unnecessary, every time I refused a purchase or resisted a distraction, I created space for growth. The silence of that discipline was not empty. It was full of promise. The mirror in the corner seemed to approve. Its crack had grown slightly, a hairline spreading across the glass like a scar. Yet it reflected me with greater clarity. I saw the hollows beneath my eyes, the tired curve of my shoulders, but I also saw resolve carved deeper than fatigue. My reflection no longer felt like a stranger. It was me, undeniably, imperfect, but unyielding. The clock's ticking grew louder on those nights, almost echoing in my skull. There was a strange comfort in its relentlessness. It reminded me that time was impartial, that it cared nothing for my struggles or victories. It simply moved forward, indifferent. And because it was indifferent, it was also dependable. I learned to align myself with its rhythm, to build wealth, not in opposition to time, but in harmony with it. The key in my pocket, warmed by my body heat, reminded me of the unseen doors that still lay ahead. I would take it out sometimes, laying it beside my notebook, its metallic gleam catching the lamplight. It was ordinary, unremarkable, but to me, it was a symbol of every opportunity I had not yet reached. I imagined doors opening one after another, not grand, golden gates, but simple thresholds that would change my life quietly, steadily, irreversibly. It was around this period that I began to experience the first taste of true momentum. My investments, though small, began to feed themselves. Dividends and interest, modest at first, grew into sums that no longer felt insignificant. I watched the numbers rise, not rapidly, but with a consistency that mirrored the ticking of the clock. There was a rhythm in it, a pulse. I realized that compounding is not dramatic. It is patient, almost invisible, until one day you look back and realize how far you've come. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. But wealth tested me too. The market does not care about discipline any more than the clock does. There were days when my investments shrank, when red numbers bled across the screen, when fear coiled in my stomach like a serpent. I remember one evening vividly. The room smelled of damp paper, the air heavy with silence. My savings had dipped, weeks of gains erased in a single day. I stared at the screen, the urge to act, to cut my losses, burning through me. My hand hovered above the mouse, trembling, and then the clock ticked. The sound cut through the fog of panic like a blade. I looked to the mirror. My reflection stared back, pale and tense, but resolute. I reached into my pocket, touched the key, and felt its cold weight steady me. These symbols, these reminders, held me in place when my instincts screamed for escape. And so I did the hardest thing I could. I waited. The days passed. The red numbers softened. The market corrected itself, and my patience was rewarded. That lesson was worth more than any profit. To endure loss without surrender, to face fear without collapsing, that was wealth in its purest form. The seasons shifted. Spring brought the scent of blooming trees through the open window, mingling with the musty odor of old paper. Summer filled the room with heat, the air heavy, the lamp unnecessary, as sunlight poured in long streams across the table. Autumn carried the crisp smell of fallen leaves, reminding me that everything, gain, loss, time moves in cycles. Winter pressed close with its silence, the radiator hissing, the walls trembling faintly with the wind. Through it all, I sat at the same table, listening to the same clock, watching the same mirror, holding the same key. The world outside changed, but my discipline did not. As my wealth grew, so too did the shape of my dreams. No longer did I think in terms of $10 or even hundreds. I thought of thousands, of investments that stretched across years, of freedom measured not in what I owned, but in what I no longer had to trade my time for. I imagined mornings where I could wake without urgency, days where I could choose work rather than be forced into it, nights where the clock ticked not as a reminder of hours lost, but as a companion in a life lived freely. The city, once overwhelming, now seemed smaller, less intimidating. I walked its streets with a different posture, not because I was wealthy yet, but because I was becoming someone who would be. The smell of roasted chestnuts, once a temptation I denied, now reminded me of that first sacrifice, that first moment of discipline that set everything in motion. I smiled at the memory, not with regret, but with gratitude. I realized then that every act of patience compounds not only money, but character. Every refusal of impulse, every endurance of fear, every quiet night spent in study and sacrifice built something within me that no market crash could take away. That was the true wealth, the man I was becoming. And so I pressed on, deeper into the rhythm, deeper into the patience, deeper into the long, steady journey that had begun with nothing more than a single $10 bill. The years had a way of softening the edges of memory, but the sound of the clock never faded. It had followed me through every chapter, from the nights of hunger and doubt to the mornings of quiet triumph. The tick had been a reminder, a metronome, a teacher. And as I sat one final time at the desk where my journey began, I understood that the clock had always been both my adversary and my ally. It pushed me, it tested me, it threatened me with its relentlessness, but it also gave me structure, rhythm, and the patience to see my path through. The mirror still leaned in the corner, the crack spreading like a river branching across its surface. I had grown older with it, and when I looked now, I no longer searched for answers. The face staring back was not uncertain, not restless. It was lined by time, yes, but it carried the calm weight of a man who had endured storms without breaking. The eyes were no longer those of a boy holding a folded bill in trembling fingers. They were steady, reflective, at peace. The mirror had shown me doubt, then resilience, then transformation. And now it showed me acceptance. The key, worn smooth from years in my pocket, lay on the desk beside me. Its grooves were softened, its shine dulled, but its meaning had only deepened. It had never opened a single physical lock, yet it had unlocked everything. Every decision, every opportunity, every sacrifice. Each had been a door, and the key had been my discipline, my patience, my belief that tomorrow was worth waiting for. I ran my thumb across its surface, feeling the cool metal, and realized I no longer needed it in my pocket. The doors I had longed to open were already behind me, wide, welcoming, permanent. Wealth had come, slowly and then all at once, the way compounding always does. What began as $10 became hundreds, thousands, then more than I could once have imagined. The numbers grew, but with them came something greater. Freedom. Not the freedom to indulge every whim, but the freedom to choose. To choose how I spent my time, where I directed my energy, who I gave my presence to. That, in the end, was the only wealth that mattered. But freedom carried its own lessons. For years, I had believed that money itself was the destination. I thought the stacks of bills, the rising account balances, the dividends dripping steadily like rain would be the answer. Yet when I arrived there, when I could look at my wealth and know I had built it, I found myself asking a different question. What now? The answer came not from the market, nor from books, nor from the echo of numbers. It came from silence, from the stillness of nights when the city slept and only the clock spoke, from the warmth of mornings when the sun streamed through the window and I needed nothing but the air I breathed, from the faces of people I loved, the rare moments when time felt suspended, when wealth was measured not in money, but in presence. I learned then that the greatest investment is not in markets, but in people, in the conversations unhurried, in the hands held, in the laughter shared. Money had given me the chance to see this, to live it, to choose it freely. It was the bridge, not the destination. Still, I never forgot the beginning. The folded $10 bill, the hunger I resisted, the candle stacked in failure, the first dividend payment so small it could have been overlooked. These were the bricks of my foundation, and I carried them with me always. Because wealth without memory is hollow. To forget the path is to lose the meaning of the journey. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. Now, as I sit here one last time, I realize that the story is not about money at all. It is about time, discipline, and reflection. It is about learning to listen to the clock, to the mirror, to the quiet voice within that whispers of patience when the world demands haste. It is about keys carried long before their doors appear, and about trusting that the right doors will open when you are ready. The clock ticks on, the mirror reflects, the key rests beside me. These symbols that once guided me now serve as reminders of what I have become. And as I close this chapter, I know the truth. Wealth is not what you hold it, is what you build within yourself. Brick by brick, moment by moment, choice by choice. If you stayed with me until the end, subscribe, like, and comment, so that these words will find you again tomorrow night.